We all carry our past connections like shadows. Light and invisible, they follow us, not allowing us to forget. It's something that seems like an invisible weight, but it unwittingly returns at the most unexpected moment, when we are at the peak of happiness or, on the contrary, in a burst of fear. And now, 14 years later, when I thought that everything was over, this shadow appeared again. And I realized that I would never be able to free myself from what was before. My relationship with him started out like a fairy tale, serene, passionate, and full of promise. He was the man I had been searching for my whole life, and I couldn't imagine that everything between us would ever become so complicated. I was his wife. We were building a life together, dreaming about the future, but something inside of me kept bugging me. Sometimes I felt like I was just a role in his life, not the foundation of it. I often found myself thinking that there was someone else before me. She was part of his past, but that past didn't want to go away. It wasn't just a memory. It was alive, feeling like an inexorable presence in our conversations, in our gazes, and even in the nights when I felt her somewhere close by, invisible but tangible. It was something that wouldn't let go of him and that would probably always be a part of us. At that moment, I didn't realize that soon she would be back. Not as a ghost of the past, but as something much more real. And here I think I know how it will end, but that's only part of the story. For no one can be prepared for what will happen when her shadow becomes part of our present, on the most important day of our lives. I couldn't understand why he was always so wary when I asked questions about her life, about her feelings, about how it all really was. What was behind this silence, and how will his past, which he tried to put behind him, come back between us the moment we think we're done? What if this shadow of the past isn't just part of his memory, but something more, alive? When I first came face to face with this past, I was stunned. It was nothing like what I had expected. It was far more exciting than I could have imagined. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a collision of two worlds that seemed so opposite and distant. But in that moment, I realized that my world would never be the same again. I thought I knew what was in store for me. But in that moment, I realized how little I knew about our future, or even his past. He and I were together. He was my world, my refuge, the person with whom I could imagine a future. He was attentive, caring, always there when I needed him. But was he ever completely mine? His eyes were sometimes clouded with memories, as if he was lost in his own thoughts at some point, as if his soul belonged to someone else, her, his ex. She was the shadow that always followed him. Despite my best efforts to ignore her presence, I could feel her image appear in his words, in his gaze, as if something from that time still clung to him, preventing him from giving himself over to me completely. Her name I'd only heard a few times, but somehow there was something strange in his voice that made me wonder. Those mute pauses when he would suddenly falter as our conversation returned to those times. I knew I had to deal with it. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter. We were building our future. We loved each other. But it couldn't be that his past didn't leave an imprint on him. Even when I tried to forget about her, something inside me wouldn't let go, especially at times when I saw his gaze sometimes become deep and thoughtful for a moment when he was alone with himself. Sometimes it seemed to me that his gaze drifted somewhere in the past, to her, to the days that had nothing to do with me, but were still a part of him. And then everything changed. It was the night I went to the same party with him. He was in his best mood, and I could feel more than just physical intimacy hovering between us. But the moment we approached the table, I felt her. Not her presence. No, she just wasn't there. But suddenly, as if on a whim, I felt a look. And not just any look, but the kind of look that makes your body tense up. I turned around, and there she was, standing a few feet away from me. Not her, but her eyes, the same eyes as his, the same eyes I'd seen in his gaze when he talked about what had happened before. I felt my breathing grow heavy. A moment, and I realized that she was the one he remembered when I wasn't around. It was her silhouette that he drew in his memories when he was silent, when he was frozen in some indefinite reverie. I knew things were about to change. We couldn't avoid her presence. She was as much a part of him as I was. Her gaze was surreptitious, but there was so much confidence in it that I felt a wave of jealousy. She wasn't doing anything obvious, but her eyes were full of something I couldn't understand. I felt my fingers clutch the glass in my hands, and suddenly his hand slid down my back, barely touching it. The slight gesture was both soothing and unsettling. "Are you okay?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but I knew he could feel it. He could feel the tension in the air increase. I tried to smile, but that smile seemed strained in her presence. His shadow grew brighter with each step, and her eyes followed my every move. There was something in her gaze that I couldn't stand. It wasn't envy or curiosity. It was something deeper, an unknown force that was pulling me along. I wanted to go out, to hide, to find solitude, but at that moment he touched me again. This time his hand slid over my shoulders, leaving a warmth that seemed a little soothing, but at the same time exhilarating. She was still staring. I couldn't take the stare anymore. I forced myself to turn around and face her. There was fire in her eyes. It wasn't hostility, but it was like she was saying, "You can be close to him, but you'll never be a real part of him." And there was something about that stirred me. "Do you know her well?" I asked when everything around me seemed to freeze. He looked confused, but remained silent. I knew that his answer hid an important part of his life that he was afraid to reveal. In that moment, I realized that this meeting was no accident. It was all part of something much bigger, and my life, her life, and his would all intertwine at the moment I was ready to know the truth. He and I sat in silence. It was an ordinary meeting in a cozy cafe where time slows down and the air is filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and easy, careless conversation. But something wasn't right. I could feel it from the start. His smile was warm, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was as if he was on edge all the time, as if he was avoiding something, hiding something. Our conversations were superficial, always about nothing, about small things, but there was an inexpressible heaviness in their background. Something lurked behind every word. And then, as our conversation died down, and I tried to pour myself another cup of coffee, he touched my hand, as if by accident. The gesture was light, barely perceptible, but I felt his warmth, and for a moment I almost forgot everything. Yet I felt something familiar in his touch, as if I'd experienced it once before. The same tenderness and distance at the same time. "Are you always so calm?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and as if strangled. I replied that yes, I liked peace and quiet, but there was more than curiosity in his gaze. He was looking for something. And it wasn't just attention. It was as if he was trying to figure out if I could be part of something important to him, or if I was just a passing encounter that didn't overshadow his past. I smiled, trying to hide my growing unease, and at that moment his hand slid over mine again. His fingers barely touched my wrist, and I felt his touch pulling me into the unknown. I looked into his eyes, and for a moment I caught something I couldn't understand. Not pain, not joy, but rather a heavy nostalgia, as if his memories were too strong for him to be fully here with what was between us. His gaze darted between me and something in the distance, as if he was seeing someone or something that wasn't part of this meeting. I decided to speak, to break the heavy atmosphere. "Why don't you ever tell me about your past loves?" I asked, not trying to hide my interest. He froze, as if my words had cut into him. Silence hung between us, and I felt his shoulders tense. He was confused, but he quickly regained control of himself. "It doesn't matter." His voice was soft, but I caught the tension in it. "The past is just a shadow." But something about that answer made me want to know even more. Why was he so cautious? Why did this past seem like something that couldn't just be left behind? At that moment, I felt the air around us change. I looked into his eyes, and there was this hidden pain in them that he didn't want to show. Everything he was telling me seemed superficial, fake. I knew there was something between us that he wasn't ready to reveal, and maybe he wasn't the only one. There was more than reticence in his words. It was like a secret he couldn't reveal himself. We sat, silent, and I felt his gaze, his touch becoming more and more saturated with something invisible. I couldn't figure out what exactly he was hiding. His lips were so close, his breath, it was all so unaccustomedly intimate. But it wasn't real. There was something alien about it, as if something invisible stood between us. Our meeting was like a strange dance, where neither of us could cross the boundary, couldn't understand what the barrier was. He leaned over to say something, but suddenly I noticed a familiar figure behind him. She was familiar, though I couldn't remember where from. The woman was standing at the entrance, and her gaze was fixed on us. I couldn't understand why there was so much excitement in her eyes, as if she knew something important. When our gazes crossed, she looked away quickly, but I caught her tension. "What are you hiding?" A thought flashed through my head, but I didn't say it out loud. It was too late. I could already sense that his past wasn't just in his memories. It was here, in this room, between us, like an invisible barrier that we were both trying to ignore. In that moment, I realized if I wanted to know the truth, I would have to face that past. And maybe it would be more painful than I could have imagined. Every night when I lay down next to him, it felt like it was just the two of us. But soon I began to feel it, that invisible shadow that followed us. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A look lost for a moment, his hand that stayed a little longer in the air, as if someone was missing that touch. I tried to ignore it, assuring myself that everything was fine. But the sensation grew stronger each time. It wasn't a direct, obvious presence. No, rather, it was like a cold wind that you couldn't hear, but that you could feel on your skin. In the moments when we were closest, in the most intimate moments, I could feel her, like she was here with us. I couldn't get rid of the thought that she was there all the time. Sometimes I thought I could see her reflection in his eyes when they became too deep, when his thoughts suddenly drifted away. It was as if, in that moment, his past was coming back, and I was just a part of him from that time. Her shadow wouldn't let go, and in those nights I realized she wasn't just his memory. She was part of us, part of me. And if I ever wanted to understand what was going on between us, I needed to face it. We were getting closer and closer, Every day our relationship blossomed, and I seemed to forget everything that had happened before. I felt like he and I were becoming part of something big that nothing could destroy. He was there for me, and I no longer worried about what his past had once been. It all seemed so far away, like an old story that could be forgotten. We were here and now, and that was all that mattered. But, as so often happens when you least expect it, the shadow was back again. The day his gaze suddenly turned cold, and his hand on my skin felt foreign. He was silent again. I was with him at the cafe, our place where he and I spent our evenings, and everything was as normal until the moment when he suddenly flinched, as if he'd heard something he couldn't hide. I noticed her in his reaction. Not physically, no, she didn't appear to us as a reality, but it was in his words, in the way he avoided my gaze, the way he answered with short pauses, the way his gestures became detached. He was thinking about something else again, someone else, and I knew it was no accident. He looked at me and I felt his gaze deepen again, as if he wasn't seeing me, but something beyond my shoulders. I couldn't figure out what it was, but in that moment I realized that he wasn't fully with me anymore. His thoughts drifted off to places I couldn't be, those times when his life was different, when it wasn't here. "Are you okay?" I asked, feeling my heart start to beat faster. He didn't answer right away. He leaned back, holding his gaze, as if he didn't want me to notice his tension. I can't focus." His voice was a little slow, and I could feel his words not quite fitting reality. It wasn't just embarrassment or fatigue. It was fear. It had to do with something I couldn't understand. My fingers tightened around the glass, and I couldn't help but notice the way his hand on the table suddenly trembled slightly. At that moment I realized she was there, she hadn't left, and now she was here again, invisible but clearly felt. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked, squeezing his palm so he wouldn't be carried away. He sighed, and I felt his breathing become ragged. His eyes darkened. I didn't know what was bothering him, but it was obvious that it wasn't me standing between him and this. It was something more. And then, as if by magic, everything became clear. His gaze was blank, but his soul was fully engulfed in memories I couldn't erase. I knew it wasn't just a moment when his thoughts returned to her. It was a moment when he couldn't ignore her presence. I felt my fingers clench as the same shadow appeared in his eyes. Not the one he was trying to forget, but the one that couldn't leave him. "She's been around the whole time, hasn't she?" I said quietly, but it was like a blow. He froze, but didn't say a word. The silence was murderous. I waited for a response, but instead I felt her gaze on me. She was in him, in every gesture he made, every word he spoke, and I knew it wasn't just a look from the past. It was something much deeper, something that wouldn't let him go, and wouldn't. I stared into his face, feeling his presence grow cold. He was near, but so far away, and in that moment I realized that it wasn't just his memories that were haunting me. It wasn't just a part of his past. It was his connection to a time he couldn't break. "I thought you and I were past this," I whispered, unable to hide my disappointment. His gaze met mine, and I saw the shadow of the past take hold of his soul again. It was as if an invisible hand had passed over us, and she was standing between us again. Our wedding day was approaching, and I was beginning to feel a tension that couldn't be explained by the preparations or the happiness that I was about to become his wife. He and I were side by side. Everything was going smoothly and everything seemed perfect. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't pre-wedding excitement. It was more than that. Maybe it was a shadow of the past that wouldn't let go, or maybe it was something elusive in our conversations, the looks that grew increasingly intense. And then, the day before the wedding, he told me this: she would be there for me. "Is she going to be your witness?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. But I felt a shiver run through my body. It was like a sudden storm taking over everything inside me. He nodded. "Yes, she. We'll be around. I think that's important." My eyes widened in surprise, and in my head I tried to assimilate the information. She? She, who had always been a part of his past? Why? Why did she have to be around again? And why was I just now finding out about it? It should have been my best friend in her place, but instead it was her. The ex. I felt like my world had crumbled, and with it went the certainty that our wedding would be the beginning of something new, something pure. It would now be a part of this day. But why? And how would her presence fit into our new life? He noticed my silence and took my hand. His touch was warm, but it couldn't chase away the fear that suddenly overwhelmed me. I realized that this wasn't just an important moment. This was the moment that would force us to truly face what we'd been trying to ignore for so long. "I know this is hard for you," he said softly, "but I can't change the past." Then, when he said it, I felt as if his words had cut something inside me. I tried to figure out what it was that had caused such pain. Why did I suddenly feel his words become not just a fact, but a curse that kept me from moving forward? We were on the threshold of a new stage of life, and his past was still a part of us. It wasn't just a fact, it was something that seemed to define our relationship. And then, at this crucial moment, when it seemed that we had overcome everything, she, the ex, came back into our lives, taking her place. When the wedding day arrived, I could feel my legs getting heavy, like I couldn't move forward. Everything around me seemed rosy, perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was there, watching my every move. For a moment, as I walked down the alley, my heart was pounding, and the moment I looked back, I met her gaze. She was standing off to the side in her white dress as if she was part of our world. It wasn't just her role, it was something more, inexpressibly permeating the atmosphere. Our gazes met, and I felt a cold flood of anxiety run through me. There was no jealousy in her eyes, but a quiet confidence. She was there, like some integral part of him, like she continued to be a part of his life, and it was something more than just being a witness. It was like a mark that couldn't be erased, like some invisible element that was firmly embedded in our reality. I felt her gaze penetrating me, and it was hard to breathe. I tried to focus on my stride, on what was happening, but her presence was too strong. This wasn't just her part. This was a part of history that she and he couldn't forget. That connection remained alive even if no one said a word about it. And as he and I walked down the aisle, I suddenly realized this wedding wasn't just our wedding. It was the moment when we became not only husband and wife, but part of something bigger, something that came with his past and found its place in our future. "Are you ready?" His question was simple, but I knew he knew how hard this was for me. He sensed my anxiety, but I couldn't explain why. I couldn't find the words to say how I felt because I felt like this wedding wasn't really our wedding, that it was already a part of us, even if I didn't want it to be. I nodded, and in that moment, despite all the worry, I realized that this wedding was not only a beginning, but a test for both of us. On our wedding day, I felt everything around me change. Everything that seemed right and perfect was suddenly filled with a tension that I couldn't ignore. It was something invisible, but so palpable that every step seemed twice as heavy. The air seemed to become dense, and I couldn't breathe fully. Everything around me was beautiful, but I could feel something invisible standing between me and what was supposed to be our beginning. She was there for me, this day, this moment when everything was supposed to be ours alone. She didn't interfere, didn't say a word, but her gaze was all over me. I could feel her eyes watching my every move, her presence creeping into the very core of my mind, a gaze full of something much deeper than mere observation. She was watching me, but not just as a witness, not as a bystander, but as someone who was still in some way involved in this moment. I caught her gaze, and even though I didn't want to admit it, something inside me clenched. I couldn't understand what exactly she was looking for in that moment. What was moving her attention? Was it curiosity, or perhaps unquenched jealousy, or perhaps something far more dangerous? I felt her gaze, full of the shadow of the past, penetrate me. It was heavy, unrelenting. She didn't look away, and I knew it wasn't an accident. He was close by, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her invisible hand was reaching out to us. She was part of this wedding, but not as a guest, but as something much more incognito. She was in his thoughts, in his past words, and I felt it begin to seep into me. I tried to focus on what was happening, tried to remember what was important to me in this moment, but one thought kept lingering in my mind. Why isn't she leaving? After the ceremony, he and I would seclude ourselves in the garden for a few moments, and everything around us seemed so peaceful. But, despite that, I couldn't forget her. I felt her shadow still hovering in the air, as if she were there, in the very air between us. And, even stranger, I realized that she wasn't the only factor that was affecting me at that moment. He walked toward me, and his hand touched mine as we stood in the shade of a large tree. I felt his touch burn me, as if his hands remembered moments not spent with me. I looked up and saw his face. His smile was so warm, but there was a shadow lurking in its depths. A shadow I couldn't move. Everything about him was suddenly new, as if it was the first time I'd really felt his presence. He leaned toward me, and it seemed like there was nothing between us but the two of us. But in that moment, as his breath touched my face, I felt his gaze shift again, as if he'd suddenly remembered something. That shadow flickered in his eyes, the one that remained despite everything that was happening. "Are you worried?" His voice was quiet, but I sensed the very tension in it that couldn't be hidden. I stopped talking. I wanted to say it was okay, that it was just pre-wedding jitters, but his touch stopped me. I felt him pull me into him, as if our intimacy wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, unspoken, passionate, and I couldn't understand how it was possible. At that moment, I felt like there was something far more intimate and inexpressible between us than just the connection between two people. His hand slid over my shoulders, and I felt his fingers gently touch my skin. It wasn't just a touch. It was a moment in which his body and his thoughts were intertwined with mine, but something else was there, as if it was all at once urgent and detached. His breathing became more and more intermittent, and I felt my own feelings begin to overwhelm me. I tried to focus, but in that moment, it felt like she was still with us. We couldn't get rid of her. I looked up, and our gazes met. There was something unspeakable in his eyes, and I felt something inside me tremble, something dark, something we were both probably trying to ignore. He was here, he was mine, but in his eyes I saw her, a shadow that hadn't gone anywhere, hadn't dissolved. You don't feel it? His question was quiet, but there was so much unspoken passion in it that I almost fainted. And that's when I realized it wasn't just an interaction with his past. It was much deeper than that. It was something that had remained between us despite all attempts to start over. We were connected by something more than just love, more than just passion. It was something that wouldn't let us go. But how long can we continue on this path without letting those feelings that still haunt us destroy what we are building? On our wedding day, everything seemed to be in place. We were ready, him, me, and her. We were all there, in that perfectly timed moment when all of life was about to turn over into a new chapter. It was the day I thought it was going to be exactly how I envisioned it. The white dress, the promises, the looks, the exchange of vows. I was supposed to feel happy, confident, and I did feel that way. But at some point, I realized that the perfect moment was actually on the verge of being ruined. She was there. It was already inevitable. She stood among our guests like a shadow, invisible but tangible. Her gaze was fixed on me from the moment I entered the hall. She was there, reserved, but her presence seemed to rise in the air, keeping me still. I could feel her eyes watching my every move, how she couldn't leave me alone, as if her desire to be a part of this day was so much stronger than just being a witness. But I tried not to think about it. I focused on him. He was there for me, and I needed to feel that this day belonged to us, just us and nothing else. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the words of the vows, feeling something important in the air. He and I exchanged glances, and I felt his hands on mine, his lips whispering the words that were to remain in our hearts forever. Everything was perfect. But as soon as I looked away for a second, everything changed. It happened as he and I approached the ring exchange table. As his fingers gently touched mine, I noticed her, standing in the corner, step forward. Our gazes met for a moment. I froze. This gaze was not just a gaze full of something vacant or curious. It was a look full of something that wasn't meant to be. In her eyes I saw not just memories, not just the past. It was something alive, something I felt she couldn't leave behind. I didn't know what to do, how to react. My gaze darted between him and her, and at that moment, when she was almost out of sight behind the crowd of guests, I felt his hand slip around my wrist. He was there, but his touch was weak, not as sure as before. It was as if he felt her presence himself. It was invisible, but so tangible that I could barely breathe. We continued with the ceremony, but 1,000 thoughts were swarming in my mind. Why? Why was she still with us? What did that meeting of eyes mean? Why was there more to her eyes than just her role in this process? What was behind that moment that I couldn't understand? We continued to exchange vows, but I could still feel her like a shadow hanging over us. And then, just when it seemed like it was about to end, I suddenly felt his hand squeeze mine too tightly, his breathing becoming ragged, as if he were struggling with something. My eyes met his, and I realized that in that moment he knew something I didn't. He was hiding something. He knew something more than just the fact that we were standing here on the altar. I felt his gaze grow cold, like he wasn't quite there anymore. And it was then, when everyone present began to applaud, when we exchanged our first kiss, that I realized that this day wasn't really our day. This was the moment when his past came back, and his future, our future, was in jeopardy. In that moment, as I tried to understand what was happening, and how it all related to what was between us, his gaze met mine again. There was something dark in his eyes, something I couldn't explain, and suddenly it was clear to me. This moment would change everything. It wasn't just a look. It was the look of a man who feels like he can't break the connection that exists between him and what was before us. That day was not only a beginning for us, but a turning point that we could not avoid. And I knew that this moment, that look, and the feelings I felt would never disappear. I tried to move forward. Everything seemed to be in place. He and I were officially husband and wife now. His shadow of the past seemed to have receded. But just when I thought everything was finally complete, I realized I couldn't shake this strange feeling. We tried to start a new life, but its presence wouldn't let us go. And it wasn't just his past. There was something in his gaze, in his movements, that wouldn't let us forget. The past is not just a memory. It lives in us, in every gesture, in every look. And in that moment, I realized that I couldn't be fully with him, because I couldn't get rid of what hadn't been said between us. With him, with her, with what they left behind, with what I couldn't understand. We were on our new path, but I found myself thinking more and more about what was going on between us. He was here, reserved, attentive, but something in his demeanor had changed. His gaze was becoming cold, and his touch not as intimate as it used to be. I noticed the way he avoided my questions, the way he tried to escape reality, as if it was all too much for him. But why? One night, as we lay in bed, I felt him tense up. He couldn't sleep. His breathing was intermittent. I rolled over on my side and looked at him. There was fear in his eyes, not the kind I'd seen before, but one I couldn't understand. "What's going on?" I asked quietly, but there was already a storm inside me. I could feel his silence, his reticence becoming my shadow. It wasn't just an uncomfortable silence, it was something hidden, something he was afraid to reveal. "I can't get rid of what was." His voice was quiet, but with that voice came heaviness, and in his words I heard the truth, not what he was hiding from me. He was hiding himself. I didn't know what to say. I felt his words squeeze me from the inside. His unspoken pain became mine. Why was I part of this game? Why, despite all the love I felt, couldn't I be his true future? And in that moment, as my thoughts overwhelmed me, his hand slid over mine, his fingers touching my skin with such tenderness that I felt everything inside me explode. I felt him not letting go of me physically, but in my soul he was distant, and I realized that his past hadn't just come back into his life. It was in him, in his every move, in his every look. It was a moment when his passion, his desire, they were still just as real, but now it was more than just physical intimacy. It was an emotion that knew no bounds. He and I were both victims of this mismatched love. There was something between us that we both couldn't understand and couldn't change. He drew me to him, but in his embrace I felt his thoughts drift to places I couldn't go. He was near, but, as always, far away. I could feel his tenderness burning me, but deep within it was fear. Fear that he couldn't break the chain. Fear that the past continued to dictate terms. "I can't live with this." His words, almost in a whisper, pierced the silence of the night. "With what?" I asked, trying to figure out what he was hiding. I knew it wasn't just about us. It was about something we couldn't understand. "With what I've lost and what I can't get back." His voice was heavy, full of uncharted pain. And in that moment, I realized he couldn't be with someone without getting over it. He couldn't be with me until he let it go. His past wouldn't leave him. We couldn't be free without dealing with what was. and the moment I felt his warmth, I also felt how his soul was cold and empty. We were attached to each other, but not because we loved each other, but because we couldn't be free of what remained between us. We all love our freedom, but there are times when you can't escape the force that pulls you back. In that moment, I realized that we were both prisoners, not just of the past, but of something that wasn't complete. We were trying to move forward, but we were going backwards, and I was scared that it wasn't just about him, but about me. That moment changed everything. When it was all over, when the wedding festivities had subsided and the guests had dispersed, I stood beside him, feeling the silence fill the space between us. We had just gotten through this day, which was supposed to be the beginning of something new, something pure. But now I realized that sometimes what seems like a beginning is actually a continuation, and not always what you expect. He and I were side by side, but I felt like an invisible wall stood between us, as if everything we'd experienced before was seeping back into our world. Her presence didn't disappear. It continued to be there, in his words, in his gaze, in the way he avoided discussing what was happening. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something more, a feeling that wouldn't let him go and probably won't let us go. In his eyes, I saw the same thing I'd seen before, a longing for something we couldn't achieve. We were trying to start over, but something kept pulling us back, and it wasn't just fear. It was an unfinished story that kept dictating terms, something that we both couldn't understand, but that had been between us from the beginning. When we were alone in our new life, I felt his hands find mine, but not like before. His touch was cold, uncertain, as if he didn't know what to do with what was left between us. He was always there for me, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. And maybe it wasn't just because of her. It was because he couldn't free himself from everything he'd left behind. We talked, but not about what really mattered. We avoided everything about her, that moment, that look that seemed to change every day. He didn't talk about it, as if he was trying to keep quiet, hoping that time would make things right. But I knew the past couldn't be silenced that way. It lives in us, and it will always live in us, even if we don't want it to. You think you can forget this? His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if he was afraid to hear the answer. I couldn't answer right away. I didn't know. We both tried to erase those moments, those looks from our minds, but something about it felt unnatural. We couldn't just forget, because the past is not forgotten. It stays with us, and sometimes it dictates how we should live our lives, and it's not always easy. I looked at him and realized that there would always be this invisible barrier between us, not a barrier that we put up, but one that was put up by events we had no control over. And even if we tried to bring the past back, we would still carry it with us. The hidden glances, the unspoken words, the pain that couldn't be completely snuffed out. Sometimes I don't think I know you as well as I'd like to, I said, feeling his gaze penetrate me as the unspeakable pain hidden in his eyes was now mine. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, and in that moment I realized that we both live with secrets that will remain between us. No matter what we've experienced, no matter what we've built, there will always be moments that we won't be able to unravel. And perhaps that was our biggest lesson. Some things are unexplainable. The past won't let go, and maybe it never will. But despite that, I realize that I have to learn to live with what is, with what we carry around, with what we can't change. And maybe sometimes, instead of trying to break those ties, We just need to learn to be a part of something bigger than we expected. We walk this path, not knowing what would happen next, but realizing one thing. Some secrets remain between us. And maybe that's the way they should be. Your thoughts and feelings about this story are incredibly important to us. After all, it's your emotions, reactions, and thoughts that help make each moment meaningful. We want to know how you felt about all these plot twists and turns, what you think will happen next. What do you think of the characters? Were there moments that touched your heart or made you think? Your impressions are what really help us create even more exciting and moving stories. Share it with us. We really appreciate your perspective.